What is hermeneutics? What is deconstruction? How many kinds of deconstruction are there? I talked with a guy who answers these questions and a whole lot more. Check this out. This is TenOnReligion. Hey peeps, it's Dr. B with TenOnReligion. If you like religion and philosophy content, one thing I really need you to do is to smash that sub button because it really helps out the channel. New episodes are posted about every 2 weeks at noon US Pacific time, so drop me some views. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different and a lot longer because I had a conversation with a philosopher named Aaron Simmons. You're going to love this. Let's get started. Hey guys, we are here with Dr. Aaron Simmons, a professor of philosophy at Furman University, someplace in South Carolina. And we're going to get into some interesting things today. So Aaron, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Mark, for having me here. And I'm in Greenville, South Carolina, the upstate, just south of the North Carolina border.
Hey, we're going to talk about a few things today, deconstruction, hermeneutics, and some other topics. So we're going to start getting into it here. And let me just, by way of a quick introduction, can you give us maybe a 2 to 3 minute soundbite on what is deconstruction?
Yeah, so the question would have been, ironically, pretty easy about a decade ago, because the answer would have been deconstruction is a very particular technical discourse in postmodern philosophy, emerging especially in the work of Jacques Derrida, and it is a way of unpacking the workings of language to reveal the hidden layers of meaning that in many ways are betrayed in what we take to be the obviousness of the words we use and the discourse in which we engage.
Yeah.
The reason that is no longer the easy answer is because and I should say there's nothing easy about deconstructionism, but the answer is easy, right? Like it's this Derridian view. The problem with that answer now is by far the more culturally prominent definition of deconstruction has to do with a very particular, let's say, motivation within traditionally religious and in particular Christian people who have engaged in a kind of faith journey whereby they have moved away from or deconstructed the claims and views and liturgies and commitments that defined their religious upbringing and their religious communities previously. So now deconstruction often is understood to be the kind of thing you will see on YouTube, where people are basically expressing disdain for and frustration with, and in many cases, trauma as a result of their religious inheritance and tradition, and trying to move past that and beyond that into either a kind of healthy atheistic worldview for some, or a rethinking of what God could look like, or Christianity could look like, or religion could look like on the other side of that deconstructed process. And so now I would say we have basically a popular form of deconstruction, which is that kind of cultural, evangelical, post-religious kind of move. And we have academic or intellectual or philosophical deconstruction, which is the philosophy of Jacques Derrida and a few others, Paul de Man and some others, who are wrestling with the way language works and its relationship to how meaning is made in our cognitive and embodied lives.
Yeah, right. So like in the evangelical and all those other spaces, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. So, you sort of partially answered this, but I mean, you definitely answered the what, what are these two things? So, I mean, why and how did deconstruction become a sort of this synonym for religious disaffiliation? And I'm going to change, we have construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. And so it's these three-part, process here. how did the philosophical idea of deconstruction then later became a synonym for religious disaffiliation? Why or how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will probably be some really good sociological texts in the next decade parsing that out. And I am not a sociologist, but as a philosopher and also somebody who still identifies within traditional religious communities and speaks a lot, engages a lot with this kind of evangelical deconstructive space, though I should make clear, in that popular sense, I have not deconstructed. I've just morphed in my awareness and relationship to the views that I was raised in as I got deeper into philosophy and aged and navigated the world in different ways, right? So I always try to make clear whenever I'm speaking in front of like a big conference, you know, for the kind of deconstructive Christian space, saying, look, I identify with a lot of what you all are going through, but I don't describe myself as that kind of deconstructionist. I'm the academic kind, right? But I'm a progressive Christian. And so I associate with and feel very sympathetic to a lot of the views that are then held both politically and theologically by deconstructive religious folks. But I think the way that these somehow got connected, I think partly it's accidental. And on the other side, I think it's actually subconscious and yet important. So the accidental part is deconstruction had a kind of popular, the academic version had a kind of popular heyday more back in kind of, I would say, the 70s and 80s. When it was gaining some cultural traction, Derrida was everywhere in the English departments and then started getting read more in the philosophy departments. I went through grad school in the late 90s and early 2000s, and of course was trained in Derrida. He kind of sucked the air out of the room by that point. And I think that this idea of deconstruction as this academic philosophical idea, of course, is not a new thing. Derrida gets this from Heidegger, who has this German term destruction, which is actually a version of unpacking the histories that we inherit as tradition. And he says that one of the things that is complicated about the way that we inherit tradition is it is, as he puts it, presented and received under the mode of obviousness. In other words, our traditions are not things that we see as contingent. We don't inherit them as revisable. They're handed to us as just the case. This is just the real world. And so Heidegger says we should deconstruct or destruct the history of these Western intellectual and philosophical ontological traditions so we can catch up to where we actually are, right?
And maybe
so
that's
Derrida...
maybe that's why it got picked up by other arenas like art and architecture and so on, right?
That's right. It's a... and I think that that's the important sort of anchor to then understand Derrida's linguistic deployment of this term, which is actually a response to the structuralists like Saussure. So if you think of academic deconstruction as an interrogation of what we tend to either ignore or take for granted, then it makes a lot of sense that rethinking one's religious tradition and the obviousness by which it was presented and conveyed and passed on to you in Sunday school or youth group or wherever, that makes sense to me, right? So the idea that deconstruction in a popular religious sense is an interrogation and moving away from what was assumed to be necessary and obvious. That's where I think you see this really deep connection. The kind of subconscious sense, though, is I think deconstruction is just such a cool term because it always includes, and Derrida makes this point repeatedly, it always includes the constructive element. And so to deconstruct, says Derrida, is never simply to tear down. It is always to build up in light of what is no longer plausible, no longer meaningful, or no longer working in our context of lived existence. And in that sense, I think I hate that the term is used, for what it's worth, very clear. as a deconstructive philosopher, I hate that this term has been deployed in these popular ways. I think it just confuses things and it makes Derrida and philosophers sound like, oh, what we're really interested in is this kind of religious trauma discourse. But that's not what Derrida's up to.
Right.
That's not what Heidegger's up to. And yet, I think it makes tons of sense to have appropriated that term and maybe even this kind of intellectual history, because it does give some really important resources for making sense of how we interrogate what we assumed to be absolutely sacrosanct and unassailable. So I think it both works and is also problematic.
So let me talk for a minute. I want to set up a situation and set up a problem, and then ask you ultimately 3 questions, because, and this is all going to revolve around some things we just already mentioned. I mean, the idea of construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. And there are a lot of social media outlets, a lot of YouTube channels in the last 5 years that have cropped up around religion. And most of them are great. And I'm going to call out some channels, and these are great channels, but I want to highlight an issue that I find with them. So, I mean, there's one of the main ones, Andrew over at Religion for Breakfast. He's great. He's done this for many, many years. He's basically a historian. He claims to be, he's a PhD in late antiquity and so on and so forth. Puts out a lot of great information, useful charts. Matt Baker puts out a lot of great information in chart form about the history of various religions. More recently, Dan McClellan has been a huge popular figure on YouTube. He started this podcast at Over Dogma. And then one of the bigger ones, again, Myth Vision podcast with Derek over there. And they provide data, they provide information, but little or no guidance on how to religiously appropriate this information that they're providing their audiences. And years ago, I perceived this, well, maybe this should be an area of concern. They have graduate degrees, most of them in the academic field of religion, but they don't realize that this sort of information historically that they're presenting, history is kind of on a sliding scale of probability, or what is more or less probable based on evidence. That's just what history is. It's not everything that has happened in the past, and so on and so forth. And so I'm wondering if these social media outlets are some kind of a microcosm of the entire academic field of religion, where we don't know how shall then we live type questions. They don't know how to answer those questions. And so, and a lot of these channels, they want to expose Christianity, as, we're going to find a problem. Moses wasn't a real person, so therefore we shouldn't believe in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. The Gospels contradict each other, therefore we shouldn't believe in Jesus, and so on and so forth. And they just focus on these historical and textual problems. For them, that is what deconstruction is, right? And so, rightly or wrongly, I feel like they're trying to say that because these problems exist, no one in their right mind should therefore have religious faith or believe in these things anymore. The Bible has contradictions, therefore we shouldn't believe the Bible anymore. And so my first question is, they think that hermeneutics is somehow tied to these textual problems, but not realizing that, as you rightly explained earlier, that these deconstruction hermeneutics, these are more philosophical issues. Recently I had somebody reply to me on a Twitter post, a Twitter comment, that they said that biblical textual hermeneutics was the real hermeneutics. Philosophical hermeneutics was something else. And I'm like, well, actually, textual hermeneutics is a subset of philosophical hermeneutics. That's what started first with Schleiermacher and all sorts of other folks. And so, why is there such a misunderstanding among religious scholars and adherents of what hermeneutics is? And I'll just throw that to you. So,
I mean, it's a great question. I think there's probably 2 layers at which this becomes exceptionally tricky to parse. One is having gotten into the space of public philosophy myself for the last 2 to 3 years. Now having my own YouTube channel, I do a Substack,
right,
writing books for popular audiences. I can definitely say that there is always a hermeneutic set of decisions one makes when trying to convey exceptionally complicated ideas to an audience that may either lack the training or just the time, right?
Yeah,
To do
yeah.
the sort of work that it takes to track with this in technical ways. And that's not in any sense to say that the academic or intellectual audience is a better audience. There's reasons why I have shifted my audience, at least for the time being, because I think academics had become so insular and so narrow in their focus that they were, we tend to talk to each other a lot about things that we all already understand. And so we're, in many ways, kind of playing the violin while Rome burns, or while authoritarianism overrides American democracy, right?
The
And so
Titanic is sinking. Da, da, da.
it's tricky to think that philosophers are fundamental, or academics are fundamentally disconnected from the space of social life. And so when you start doing more popular things and reaching new audiences, there's always going to be not a dumbing down. I don't think that that's necessary, but there is going to be a simplifying, a lack of some nuance is necessary, because the kind of nuance that academics are very happy to engage in is something that not only makes it really, really bad public consumption,
Yeah,
it also can distract from the point that is trying to be made. So at one level, I don't think that a lot of the religious hermeneutic folks, the popular YouTubers and podcasters, if they are also academics, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that they are bad at hermeneutics. I think that in many cases, what they're doing is biting some bullets that they've decided are worth biting to convey certain types of content to a broader audience in ways that is accessible, consumable, and productive, right?
yeah. So they're trying to
We
grow their audience, use buzzwords.
Yeah. It seems to me that if you're trying to spread the good word of philosophy to a bigger group, you have to figure out, well, what are the ways of doing this that the group finds interesting and want to invite their friends to participate in, right? And so I don't have a whole lot of blame at that level. I think that that's something that's just necessary. It's part of what we do. You have to make these translation efforts. But at the same time, so that's giving them lots of credit to say, I think they're doing really good work and it's important.
Right.
We've got to cut them some slack. While also begging readers of me to like, cut me some slack. You can read my academic stuff, but nobody does. Right? Like only academics read that. So I'm trying to reach a bigger audience, and so I'm making some sacrifices. But at the same time, I think one of the things that is generally problematic in academic spaces that then plays out in popular ones, and this is where I think all of us probably deserve some blame, we are very narrowly insular in our disciplinary allegiances. So as a philosopher of religion, I actually had to almost step away from the mode in which we normally do philosophy of religion to start reading deeply in the academic study of religion, and religious studies, and sociology of religion, and history of world religions, critical theory of religion. Like these discourses, which are unbelievably productive resources for my work as a philosopher of religion, are not very often seen as the right conversation partners. Philosophers talk to philosophers about something called religion. Religious studies folk talk to religious studies folk about something called religion. And then often they claim what they're doing is philosophy. But they're not often talking to philosophers, and the philosophers talking about something called religion aren't talking to the religious studies folk, right? And that split,
So we have a silo problem.
Yeah, I mean it's disciplinary chauvinism,
Yeah.
and that actually has led, I think, to some of the popular audience content reflecting that siloed insularity. So it makes sense that if you are a biblical hermeneutics person and not a philosopher, that the content you would generate would probably not be as owing to the authority structures and the responsibilities that would be required as a philosopher in that guild. But similarly, we philosophers tend to produce popular content that is deeply philosophically interesting, but sometimes disconnected from some of the actual sociological or historical realities that attend these traditions called religion. And so I think that's really where things have gone wrong, is not only have we gotten insulated as the academy from broader social discourse, and then these people are trying to overcome that in respectable ways, we've also in the academy gotten siloed from each other, and that then continues to play out in our popular discourse. And that's where I think we are sometimes not as good as we could be, because we need to be talking to each other in front of broader audiences, rather than just trying to draw the audience to ourselves in order to increase the algorithmic traction and our followers, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, we're all beholden to the great algorithm. So let me ask my second question. So my initial question, let me ask a question, let me explain a little bit more. So my initial question is what can done, or what can be done, or what needs to be done to counteract this push towards painting religion in a negative light. But let me parse it out a little bit. So if content creators, myself included, and some academic scholars can't even get it right, they're always pushing out, negative buzzwords on their thumbnails so people will click on it, and so on and so forth. And then they do this whole, video, whether it's an interview or a teaching video on the Bible or this, that, or the other thing, I've even seen things on Islam and Hinduism and Judaism. I mean, this is not only Christianity, so I mean, if content creators and some academic scholars can't even get it right, I mean, what hope is there for leaders of religious communities? People are leaving organized religion left and right in all sorts of movements. I mean, evangelical and others, often during high school or soon after, in college. And so some places of worship, they meet felt needs and the emotion is there. But then, these people are like, but then what? This is my grandparents' religion, and so on and so forth. Our religious communities only social clubs. How, where, and why are they failing as communities participating in a larger cohort of this word we call religion? And so what can be done, or what needs to be done to counteract this push?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think the wrinkle here is, and of course, as a philosopher, right, we always interrogate the question and then try to give an answer to the better question. So my interrogation of the question is, I'm not entirely sure what it means to get it right as concerns religion, because I think that the questions about, well, what would we get right, are themselves shaped by these hermeneutic or interpretive contexts and lived communities in which we find ourselves. So
sure.
For the evangelicals, getting it right means, how can I make sense of the divine or relate to the idea of God in ways that don't require me to hate my LGBTQ friends, right? So getting it right might look like, how do I overcome, or if I identify as queer, is it the case that the church actually, hates me, or does God hate me? These realities of inclusion and hospitality, which from where I stand, I think must be radically integrated into any truly biblical account of something like Christianity, because that's the core value of what we see both the God in the Hebrew Bible and also Jesus New Testament reveal, is radical hospitality. But the churches don't really do that very well, and they tend to identify themselves according to divisions and obstinacy and rejection and antagonism. So getting it right might be, how can we overcome the very politicization of how we understand inclusion to look as reinforcing or rupturing our sense of historical power, right? But that's a different question than, are we understanding religion correctly in a critical theories of religion space? And that's where I think it's really important that philosophers, who tend to, sadly, just assume by religion we mean classical theism, right? This very particular notion of God as omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient. And then you've got critical theory of religions saying, well, wait a minute. Is religion actually reducible to cognitive assent about the being of something called God? Maybe religion is actually more compellingly understood as a functionalist discourse that unites communities around certain modes of shared action. And those are getting it right, assuming there is a thing that it is to be religion, and yet the history of religions and the history of discourses about religion continue to show us this is a slippery discourse, to be sure, right? And then the third point about getting it right, and then I'll answer the what can we do. The third idea would be, well, what about philosophy of religion? Well, traditionally, it's not been interested in defining religion. It's been interested in, are certain propositional claims about God true? And here, notice, the only conceptions of God that are often in play are those conceptions that sadly have been deployed in our popular discourse and our historical communities in ways that then are received by far too many people as exclusive, marginalizing, and unjust.
So it needs to be globalized and so on and so forth.
We've got to globalize,
Yeah.
we've got to be self-critical, we've got to be more hospitable, and then we've got to, what can we do? We can do that as academics. So I actually co-edit a book series with Kevin Shilbrack at Bloomsbury called Expanding Philosophy of Religion. And it's trying to globalize and make more critically aware the discourse of philosophy of religion. So that's what we can do as academics, right? We can talk to each other in more interesting and compelling ways. What can we do on the ground? Well, to be honest, I think we can invite, and here I'll speak specifically to Christian churches. That's what I have been raised in. That's where most of the spaces that I think about exist. But it's not exclusively them. But Christian churches can be willing to interrogate the reinforcement of the status quo that then gets deployed as a particular manifestation of a political vision as simply entailed by their theological views.
Yeah.
And I'll say that slightly less complicated.
Yeah,
Christian churches need to be less convinced that being a good Republican is the same thing as being a good Christian. And if they could be less convinced of that identity, I think they would be robustly more interested in both challenging the hegemonies, challenging the exclusivist sort of wagon circling model of their social engagement. But also they would then maybe be more receptive to academic discourse that helps them think about what they're actually doing. Right now, this wagon circling is we've got to protect ourselves from those liberals that are ruining our country. And where are those liberals trained? At those universities. Like, notice there's a double resistance to being available for critique, and that immunizing of themselves from criticism from either their own congregants who have been traumatized by the way that they enact their beliefs, or the academy saying, hey, maybe the way you understand your own views could be enlightened by understanding your history more compellingly. Both of those are anathema. Both of those have to be rejected, because otherwise we've sold our soul to this cultural degradation. We're sliding toward, hell. And this is happening by calling it philosophy. But in fact, we're now becoming liberals. So those two go together. Academics get better talking to each other and being more globally aware and responsible. We become more inclusive and hospitable. And hopefully the churches will do the same and then be more interested in talking with and learning from the kind of work that we do.
Yeah. So let me start to transition that into my third question. So, I mean, we have the Protestant Reformation, and then we have Martin Luther and others, Erasmus and so on and so forth in Christianity. And then they push everything more away from the tradition and more into the text, right? And so, eventually 500 years later, we have, inerrancy and all sorts of things going on. And that is coupled too closely with what it means to be a Christian. They can't, if you ask somebody what is, the Bible, what is God, somehow those things are conflated, right? And so, yeah, the Bible and God are somehow not the same thing, is a problematic statement for a lot of people. So, and this becomes a problem for the evangelicals, when you say things like, like you mentioned, LGBT. So, like the word homosexuality, as far as I understand, the English word didn't appear in any English translation of the Bible until like the 1960s. This is, people don't understand this, right? And when you explain that, we have, this cognitive problem that takes place, but at the same time, as academic scholars, we can't expect the average religious adherent to understand religion like an academic scholar does, whether it be a theologian, a philosopher, and so on and so forth. They're not going to study phenomenology. They're not going to study Kierkegaard, more or less. They're not going to study, Paul Tillich. And these types of things have very obvious answers to the issues that they are experiencing. So, I mean, what is a reasonable expectation? How much does an average religious adherent who has questions about this, they say, when they hear, homosexuality as a word didn't appear in the Bible until the 1960s. So what is it? What was it? Why is that not an issue? Why is it? Why? So how much do they need to know in order to remain a genuine adherent and still choose to be religiously observant? How do we, sort of, what are we communicating? How do we solve this issue? Because again, as some of these, podcasters and YouTubers and TikTokers, I mean, their answer is, let me just show you why you have a misunderstanding of the text, why you have a misunderstanding of who Jesus was, why you have a misunderstanding of who Moses was, and all these. They're just explaining the misunderstanding. So they're doing the construction and the deconstruction part, but they're not doing the reconstruction part. So, how do we get there?
Yeah. I think that underneath hermeneutic awareness, which again, for people who keep hearing us use that word, it just means that there is never a text or a situation or a circumstance that doesn't require some level of interpretive decision.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I walk into a classroom, all the chairs are facing one direction. There's usually a podium up at the front. Notice this is a text that I'm reading, but I don't go in and turn all the chairs facing the back wall, because I'm interpreting this as, oh, here's the audience. They're all focused on the front. This is where the person, probably with some sort of special training, communicates some sort of knowledge that they're trying to then learn, right? There's a degree of authority that is positioned singularly. There's only one podium. There's a degree of equality distributed among the students. This is why we have lots of chairs, right? I'm interpreting this circumstance when I walk in and sit down. The same is true when we walk into churches, when we navigate Walmart, when we pick up books or listen to podcasts. We're always making interpretive decisions. The problem is not just, I'm going to say the recent history of Christian practice, but I think you're right. It goes back to a particular mode in which the Reformation was received and deployed. Because in many ways, I mean, let's be honest, like Luther and Calvin and others, they were basically like early influencers, right? I mean, their mode of discourse was not podcasting and YouTube, but they were trying to build an audience and build a community and also build a brand. And in doing this, there had to be a logic deployed that created a distaste for the other options. And that logic is what I think we now inherit in lots of different forms, but it basically functions this way. And I think it can go all the way back to the way the Reformation had to kind of present what it was up to. And it's basically this, and this logic goes even further back into medieval Catholicism, where the idea was, will you be redeemed and go to heaven, or will you go to hell and be burned and poked by devils? Look at the stained glass. It's an easy logic of a binary choice.
Read Dante's Inferno.
It doesn't give you lots of third and fourth and fifth possible. Like you are either fully in on the good or fully out on the bad.
So
that logic of binary,
the binary really is driving some of this. Yeah,
it drives it, and this then gets picked up such that Protestants, of course, couldn't present. Well, there's a lot of complicated different ways of making sense of Catholicism. Eventually, it had to be, that's problematic. We are the ones, sola scriptura, only the Bible, who really understand what's going on. Those priests are disastrous. And that binary logic now shows up, biblical inerrancy, all of it's jot and tittle correct, or all of it is just made up and just a book like any other. You end up with that dichotomy, that binary being presented, and now you've got basically 2 or 3 generations of pastors that have been trained at the seminaries that were wedded to one side or the other of these binaries. And so at one level, right, I mean, it's kind of weird to say you can't blame them for just reflecting their training. At another level, it's, yeah, but this is deeply disastrous and antithetical to everything we find. And here I'll sound a little bit Christian, in the radical model of God represented in the story and person of Christ, challenging and rupturing the binary categories and the dichotomies that were actually presented by the religious authorities in his time, right? Like the very manifestation of Christian incarnation is a rejection of what the culture assumed as the only ways things could work. And so I think what we've got to do now is help people understand that part of the ex-evangelical deconstructive religious kind of move, which again, I have lots of sympathies for. I was raised evangelical. I no longer use that term because I'm not conservative. And I think sadly that term now just reflects a kind of conservative politics.
Political word, right?
It's a political word, but I still attend an Assemblies of God church. I'm still a 4th generation Pentecostal. Like these are also still parts of my identity. And so I don't consider myself ex-evangelical in the deconstructive sense. I've progressed in, I think, my thinking about God and the world and my thinking about the church. And as a result, church is hard, but I don't think Christianity's as hard, right? But the problem is when you've been presented Christianity by a church that said it is either this with no exceptions and no revisions, or it is nothing. If those are the only options you've been given, then it can be very easy in light of genuine trauma, genuine exclusion, genuine injustice and racism and sexism and homophobia modeled by the church as just being good Christians. It's easy to think, well, then the only other option, I can't do that anymore, so I'm out. And the I'm out becomes a community now of people who are affinity related by their shared distaste and frustration. And basically now they see it as a deprogramming of how they had been taught, to understand themselves in the world. So it makes sense. The problem is that assumes and embraces the same dichotomy that was so dangerous in the churches that they've left. And that's where I'm trying to step in and say academic deconstruction as this other thing is a profound resource when made accessible and intelligible and produced in popular ways. It's a profound resource for challenging the binary. The fundamental Derridian insight is that binaries almost always aren't, right? Like that dichotomies are almost always deployed by power structures to reinforce their own status.
Right.
And when we see that problem, we can overcome that set of choices as exclusive. And when we see there's lots of ways to make sense of this, there's a whole bunch of ways to move forward. We can become not only hospitable to new options and new possibilities, but we become hospitable to new conversation partners who remind us that we are always tempted by, we might call a kind of discursive closure, that we're going to narrow the wagons because now we deconstructives, those fools, the bigots, we hate those guys because we're the ones who've got it all figured out. And even though I am sympathetic and agree with them on the politics, I tend to think, well, yeah, but you threw out a whole bunch of baby with bathwater, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think we've now just become what Nietzsche would call the inversion of the thing we've rejected.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is deeply problematic. And so I'm trying my best to speak in these spaces, not to tell them, hey, y'all go back to church. Church is a mess. But to tell them, maybe what Christianity has always been possibly able to mean is something that is itself the best critique of the churches that you've left, right? Kierkegaard says we bring Christianity to Christendom because the churches are now engaged in idolatry, bibliolatries, where they think the Bible just is God,
Right.
but all kinds of idolatries. I would suggest that the current manifestation of the kind of cult of Trump is a kind of idolatry, right? And that reality is one that is, I think, hermeneutically understandable, but it's also something that we can do better than to give into. And that's where I think we philosophers, we intellectuals do have the burden of responsibility not to invite our audience to grow at the cost of reinforcing the dichotomy such that now our audience is defined by hating those guys. That actually is the very thing that we're critical of those guys for being. And that, I think, is a big shame. We can do better than that.
So how do we, I mean, you explained this really, really well. I mean, it's like, we have, again, I'm going back to popular media outlets that really fuel some of this deconstruction stuff, where you have and again, Religion for Breakfast, Andrew, he does a great job and has been doing a great job for many, many years, focusing on the history and the text. And even he delves into a lot of other religions. Dan McClellan, Derek and Myth Vision podcast. But I mean, they're saying because the text, it's different than what you think it is. It's different than what you've been told growing up in your church and your pastor's sermon and your Sunday school. With all these narratives and these words don't mean what you think they mean. But I mean, they do the deconstruction part really well, and the textual criticism and the historical criticism really well, and then they just leave their viewers hanging. That they don't offer anything else other than that. And maybe it's because they've never gone farther than that. I'm not sure. And it's just like you have all these other options, coming from the perspective of Herman. I mean, they've had this Gadamerian moment, where they have these fusions of horizons, but my horizon isn't big enough, and so, some people go the way of Karl Barth and they just go down the fideism and all of that kind of stuff. Some people, you and others, and this is a very live option, existentialism and Kierkegaard style and all of that. Many people have really gotten into the Whitehead thing with process. John Cobb, open relational theology, and that's an option for me. That's a little bit too metaphysically laden, but that's just my take on that. I go the way of the ground of being, through Heidegger and Tillich and Robert Neville. Robert Neville is too complicated for most people. I try to break it down and make it simpler. Because the whole Tillich thing, and I have a lot of videos on Tillich on my channel, that works well for me, and some people resonate with that. But I mean, these are all better options to me than just let me just give you all this textual criticism, all this historical criticism, and let you just leave you hanging, and you just leave your church because your pastor doesn't know any of this. He's never been trained in this. He doesn't know how to answer these types of questions, and so therefore the church or any religious community is no longer for you. I don't know. It's not like I can just, email some of these guys and say, hey, can I be on your show? It's like they're not gonna, I'm gonna have the textual critic on my show. I'm gonna have the historical critic on my show. I'm not gonna have a philosopher who reconstructs all of this and makes it make sense because I don't have an audience anymore. I mean, like, how do I respond to this? I could just do what I do and then hope to, that their audience also sees me, or I mean, like what do I do?
Yeah, no, I get it. So I think you're right to say it is much harder to propose new ways forward than it is to propose why the old ways are a dead end.
Okay.
And this is actually something that Richard Rorty, the certainly no fan of religion,
You're
said.
right.
He said in a political space, which I think is really smart. He said, critique is fine, alternatives are better. Right? And that sense that if we just kind of make our brand a critique, there's a kind of I mean, it's easy to make that sexy because again, it looks like you're opening the world to people because you're showing them, hey, what you assumed was closed and obvious is actually not. There's a whole lot more than you realize. But if you're then suggesting there's a whole bunch of alternatives, notice, like even in your account of this, the problem becomes, but I'm trying to be responsible by saying there's a variety of alternatives in play. Well, that's not going to make you a big audience. What gets you an audience is saying, and my alternative's the right one, right?
So we need to be politically mudslinging. We need to be, this guy, he can't close the border, but look at all this infrastructure I've done. No, it's a matter of getting people angry and what sells.
Get them angry. We've said for a long time in human history, we've said, rightly, you don't need a god, but you got to have a devil, right? There's got to be an antagonism. And I think that one of the things that I find so awesome about our current cacophony of content creators is that you can find pretty much anything and somebody's defending it. The problem is it becomes exceedingly difficult to wade through the quality to decide, well, what is being responsible and what is not.
That's a big issue right there.
It's tough. My brother, I have a YouTube channel called Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, and then a Substack called Philosophy in the Wild. But my brother keeps saying, dude, if you want to really grow your audience, just throw a cat off a roof and film it.
Yeah, right.
And he's like, because half the world will think that's hilarious. The other half will be outraged. They're all watching, right?
Yeah.
And the problem is I'm a philosopher and I think, yeah, but I want them to watch and think with me, not because I've got something figured out, but because I'm hopefully encouraging them to realize that joy is possible in the face of temptations to despair. And we've got to lean into the difficult work of thinking well with people with whom we disagree. But that's not sexy, right? So I think the best we can do is link up with and tag team with people who find themselves gaining traction in different spaces. So some of my friends who I respect very, very highly in the kind of evangelical space, people like Trip Fuller at Homebrewed Christianity, he's hardcore process. I disagree with him about process. I'm an open theist, but we've had those debates in public on his podcast and at conferences, and it creates this dynamic awareness that, look, we both think the other person's missed it somewhere, but we want to be sharing the stage and the microphone with each other because this helps both of us get better. Right.
And you have a foundational agreement on Christianity is not something, but it can be something else.
That's exactly right. And, my buddy Tim Whitaker over at the New Evangelicals, that guy's doing, he's not an academic, but he's doing very responsible work thinking about how Christian nationalism is the new idolatry to oppose. It's not Christianity, but in the name of Christianity, let's oppose this thing that is becoming increasingly prominent and dangerous, right? So he's got this huge audience, but they're coming together as an almost, I think this impressively, kind of a political action group trying to resist and make aware this is what's going on. This should trouble us. And then we've got people like Dan Koch, who is an academic therapist. He does psychology and psychoanalysis, and he's got a podcast, You Have Permission, doing amazing stuff, trying to think about, well, what is this trauma that the churches have been responsible for causing? How do we think about this? What would health really look like on the other side of it? It might mean moving into a robust atheism, and this is actually a legitimate possibility. I say somewhere in my recent book, I talk to atheists because they might be right.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean,
that's healthy.
Christopher Hitchens is still really popular. I mean, even going back, like when I was in college, I read, Albert Camus' The Plague and The Rats Win, and and some people just want to leave the organized religion and go down that path. And part of me is like, well, that is a legitimate path, but what does that path actually lead to? Are there better paths, right? Are there other paths that could better engage you as a human person in a society?
And my view is there might be, but part of what I worry about is not that they would go down, the Camus, Nietzsche, Sartre, Hitchens path.
No,
I'm actually cool. If you're gonna go down that path, do it on purpose and be aware that there are other options that you're actively rejecting because you find this one more meaningful. Don't go down that path because you think the only other option is bigoted, racist, homophobic Christians, right? That's the thing that I want to reject, is that dichotomy, that binary, and always invite people to think with me. I draw on the existentialists. I certainly lean into an open theological space, but that's just because that's where I find myself. But I try my best to have the conversation partners, like in my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, which is for a popular audience.
Yeah.
My conversation partners are Camus and Nietzsche and Sartre. Like they are fellow travelers thinking about what makes life worth living, that I then differ with them about the direction of our existential risk. Cool. But we're all thinking with each other about what it looks like to live on purpose, find joy along the way, and maybe even not have to see everybody else as your enemy. Like maybe there's a way to do that and do it responsibly, to stand for justice, to stand against injustice, and yet do it in a way that doesn't require you to hate half of the people that you see at Walmart, right?
Well, it's so then it's about, I guess if I were to sum up our conversation here, it would be, we need to find a way to expand horizons, I guess, because people,
I think that's right,
haven't been exposed to certain interpretations, and so they don't know that they exist, right? And so maybe
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And this is deconstruction in the academic mode.
Yeah.
Right. What deconstruction in the academic mode does is expands horizons. What deconstruction in the popular religious mode does, or can do far too often, is limit horizons, because it often, not always, but it often can just replace one option with another, but retain the same exclusivism. And that's what I think that a little bit more philosophically aware approach might help us realize. Oh, I don't either have to be dogmatic disciple or absolutely, antagonistic, right? Like there can also be lots of other ways to make sense of these things. And it also then allows us to recognize, I think, in productive ways, the pastors doing really boneheaded stuff in the church spaces. We should be critical of this. We should be critical of the nationalism. We should be critical of the homophobia. But we can do that while also reminding ourselves they are inheriting a tradition as obvious too, right? So it's, yes, something of which to be critical, but it's also something in relation to which finding the ability to show hermeneutic charity and say, I get why you hold this view. if that were the only thing I had ever been taught, and I had been expressed this with, you either hold this or you're spending eternity in hell, man, like that would be pretty compelling to me.
Well,
I probably would slide there as well, right?
So it's
that's helpful.
Taking off the political blinders, political in the sense of power, not necessarily government. You know, who wants to be who controls the conversation, right? And so taking off the and then so that is deconstruction in the philosophical mode, because we are, you know, the meaning is being deferred and redefined.
That's right.
And so on and so forth.
That's exactly right. And in this sense, I support and stand with those deconstructing in a religious sense, because I think that what they oppose is worth opposing. But I also want to at least caution and invite them not to then think that circling the wagons and reinforcing their own anger is maybe a good way forward. And I think lots of them have rejected that, and again, are productive, interesting, vibrant thinkers and humans. I do worry a little bit, though, about some of what I see on the kind of viral videos on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, where it sure can seem like what's going to get you the audience and get you the popularity is just being the inverse of the thing that you're now advocating that we hate. And I'd rather stand with Anne Lamott, who says if we let them get us to hate them, they've won. And so I think that maybe we should deconstruct the animosity that too often deconstructing invites. And that's where I think we can do that most effectively, by leaning into something like Derrida, something like existentialism. This actually becomes a resource for what we are doing in the name of those discourses.
Right, because you don't want to get to a point where you look in the mirror and then you suddenly have this realization years down the road, you know, we have seen the enemy and he is us, right? So
that's exactly right. That's right. That's right.
All right.
Well, Mark, this is important work. I support what you're doing. I encourage you, and whatever I can do to, you know, expand that audience with and for you. I think it's important that we do our best to stand in that gap. C.S. Lewis once said that when he looked around for what to do with his life, he went where no one else was standing in line. And so I want to encourage you, because I have to encourage myself in this. It matters that we stand in a space that maybe doesn't have the big audience, because maybe what it's doing is helping the big audiences get better at figuring out why it matters to be where they are. And so keep up the good work, man. Excited to see you doing it.
Aaron Simmons, thanks so much for the conversation, man.
I enjoyed it. Take care.
So what do you think about our convo? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed this, support the channel in the link below. Please like and share this video and subscribe to this channel. This is TenOnReligion.